From May 10, 2011, the following is part 2 of a two-part examination of the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. The forum is presented by the North Carolina History Project, Campbell Law School, and the North Carolina Institute for Constitutional Law. In part 1, historian Paul Bergeron discussed 7 things to know about Andrew Johnson. In this second part, author David Stewart explores the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson.
I want to thank Judge John Tyson for his support for this event. The event was started with an idea, a conversation that he and I had, and that resulted in what we have tonight. So I want to thank him for his support in this endeavor and deeming it a worthwhile thing to pursue. Without further comment, I'll turn it over to Judge Tyson to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Troy. On behalf of the Campbell Law School, I'd like to welcome each one of you here tonight. I'm a charter class graduate of this law school, and I've taught here for 25 years. In fact, I just turned in my final exams on Monday. So on behalf of the dean and the staff, I'd like to welcome you here to Campbell, who graciously agreed to jointly sponsor this program. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker, and I want to tell you how I came to meet David Stewart. Last November, I attended a appellate judicial conference in Dallas, Texas by the ABA. And David was on the agenda to speak during lunch. Now, if you can hold the attention of 300 state and federal judges for an hour over lunch, that says a lot about a man's speaking ability. So David had rapt attendance and rapt attention from all of the judges that were there. Let me tell you a little bit about him. David is an attorney, a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School. For 25 years, he has been an active litigator and trial counsel. He has defended accused criminals, challenged government actions as unconstitutional, and argued many appeals, including 2 before the United States Supreme Court. After graduation from law school, he clerked for U.S. Justice Lewis Powell, who was a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. He has written his 3rd book. The first book, which was warmly received, is entitled The Summer of 1787, The Men Who Invented the Constitution. That became a Washington Post bestseller and the winner of the Washington Writing Award for the best book of 2007. That accomplishment was followed by the current book that brings him here tonight, which is Impeach, the Trial of President Andrew Johnson and the Fight for Lincoln's Legacy. That was published in 2009. It became a Davis Kid bestseller. He is currently working on a biography of Aaron Burr. As many of you remember, Burr was the vice president under President Jefferson, and that will be released this fall. The title of the book will be American Emperor, Aaron Burr's Challenge to Jefferson's America, again to be published by Simon Schuster in October. So let's give a warm North Carolina welcome to David Stewart. This is his first trip to Raleigh.
Thank you, Judge Tyson, and thank you all for coming here. It is a great pleasure to be here, and the judge took me around to some Andrew Johnson sites today, which was interesting. It's always illuminating and always a little frustrating, since I take it we think the kitchen was where he was born, but we're not quite sure. So there's a whole lot of that in history, unfortunately. I do get the question sometimes, why did I want to write about Andrew Johnson and the impeachment trial? It's not something, as Paul has suggested, that's on the front burner every day in people's lives. And there were a couple of reasons. One was after my first book, which was about writing the Constitution, that was a moment that really saved the country. The country was at risk of falling apart. And I wanted to look at another moment when the Constitution mattered, when it made a difference in the nation continuing. And of course, the Civil War was a great failure of the Constitution. All those terrible compromises that had been struck over slavery during the Constitutional Convention didn't hold up. And we ended up killing each other. And just a few years later, we have this impeachment crisis, which is really an aftershock of the Civil War in many ways. And the Constitution seemed to work then, seemed to hold the country together, and that was an interesting subject for me. The other reason is that I actually defended an impeachment case in the U.S. Senate. I defended a federal judge from South Mississippi, a fellow named Walter Nixon. Nixon is not a good name in an impeachment case. And I studied the Johnson trial the way a trial lawyer studies a precedent. I was looking for stuff that could hurt me and stuff that could help me. And I couldn't make any sense out of the case. So I figured it couldn't hurt me and it couldn't help me, so I was just going to keep moving. But that always bothered me. And so I wanted to come back and try to make sense out of the case. So those were my particular reasons. I didn't appreciate when I started it that it would require me to speak in public repeatedly about a case I had lost. It's nothing that a lawyer actually enjoys. So let's just keep moving. I'm going to talk about three topics here about the impeachment. First, what was at stake at the trial, and why was there a trial? We've had a lot of unsuccessful presidents. Most of them didn't get impeached. So what was in the air, what was in the water in 1868 that caused Andrew Johnson to get impeached? The second is, one of the few things people tend to know about Johnson is that he escaped conviction by a single vote. And just to do some of the groundwork here, the House of Representatives impeaches, they approve the charges, and they do that by a majority vote. Then the case goes to the Senate tries those charges, and they have to vote by a 2/3 majority to convict, and then the defendant, or the respondent, is removed from office. That's the only thing he suffers, is he's removed from office. He can be disqualified from holding federal office in the future. Well, Johnson escaped removal by a single vote. And why was he able to escape that conviction? And then the third thing at the end, I do want to talk a little about the impeachment process itself as a constitutional process, both its strengths and its weaknesses. This is a CLE program, so we may as well talk about a little law. You do have to understand the moment when Johnson becomes president. It is a terrible moment. The assassination of Lincoln is a searing experience for the people in the northern states. I think considerably less so for the southern citizens. It's right at the moment of victory. There is a terrific bittersweet quality to it. It's only 5 weeks into his new term, so Johnson really came very close to a full term as president. But much of the nation wondered right then, in that moment, who is Andrew Johnson? He was not a well-known figure outside of Tennessee. He was a running mate, and I agree with Paul on this subject, even while he gets ripped to shreds by other people about it, that Lincoln picked him. There is no smoking gun that shows it, but we can't just say Lincoln's the brilliant politician and then say that he didn't pick his own vice presidential candidate. I just can't make sense out of that. And he picked him for totally political reasons. He was executing what we would call a move to the middle. He didn't need Hannibal Hamlin. Hannibal Hamlin was an abolitionist from Maine. The people in New England were going to have to vote for Lincoln. The Democrats were not anything they could vote for. And that's the other piece of ground rule I have to establish here. This is the 1860s. The Democrats are the conservatives and the Republicans are the liberals. You just repeat that to yourself a couple of times, you can get comfortable with it, because it's different. So they knew, he knew he didn't need Hamlin, and that he wanted to appeal to more moderate border state voters, to Democrats, war Democrats, and that's what Johnson was. In fact, Lincoln renamed his party for the 1864 election. He made it the Union Party, not the Republican Party. Just give you a flavor for the move to the middle he was trying to make. Now, Lincoln and Johnson had some characteristics in common. They were both very poor boys. If anything, Johnson came from a more deprived background. They were both self-educated, basically. Lincoln went to school, I think, for 3 months, Johnson not at all. But there were some big differences. Ironically, Lincoln was much less experienced as a politician. Johnson had held basically every elective office you could hold. Been alderman, mayor, state senator, congressman, governor, senator, vice president. Lincoln had been a state legislator for a couple of terms and a congressman for a term. That was it. Indeed, you may recall from the 2008 election, when they were criticizing Obama for his lack of experience, the response was, well, Andrew Johnson had all the experience in the world, and look how he turned out. They also came from very different traditions. Lincoln identified with the Whigs and then the Republican Party, which was an anti-slavery party. He was by no means a radical abolitionist, but he stood with the anti-slavery party. And he saw slavery as a moral issue. He could say, and did say, if anything is wrong, slavery is wrong. And Johnson didn't see slavery in moral terms. He owned slaves. They were house servants, basically. And as was suggested, he was overtly racist in his attitudes. He actually wrote in a State of the Union message that the greatest risk the nation had ever faced was black suffrage. This is in 1867, I think was the year. And that it was going to Africanize the South. This was language that was current at the time. At a personal level, there was a substantial difference too. We know Lincoln now through all of his sort of cute stories, the folksy humor, and the, you know, he's just a charming guy even 150 years later with these stories of farmers plowing and being wise and witty. And Johnson wasn't funny. There are no Andrew Johnson jokes. I looked for them. No witty riposts. He was a powerful speaker. He could speak for 4 or 5 hours at a time. Very articulate, but not charming. And I think that colored his presidency, and it certainly colored how he's viewed in history. Indeed, his bodyguard in the White House remembered him later as the best hater I ever knew. And President Polk, who was also a Tennessean, described him as vindictive and perverse. He was a tough guy. This was no panty waste. This was a guy who played politics for keeps. Now, what was the country that he was supposed to lead? There had been brutal human losses. 600,000 soldiers had died. Comparable death rate today would be 6 million. It's hard to imagine just the loss that was suffered. Everybody knew somebody who had been killed. A lot of people knew a lot of people who had been killed. They were angry about it. They hated. And that's a real theme for this period. On both sides, people hated. And it drives much of what happens. And it wasn't just the soldiers. Women and children, old people were driven from their homes all through the border states and in the South. They suffered from disease, from privation. It was a bitter, bitter time. On top of that, though, there was this unprecedented social convulsion, which was the end of slavery. 4 million black people were going to be free. What did that mean, and what were we going to do with them? The black people thought they knew what that meant. They thought it meant, most of them, that they'd have the same rights as white people. A lot of them, as soon as they got their freedom, just went out and walked on the roads. Most of them hadn't been allowed to do that without a pass. They went to find family members who had been sold to different plantations or different parts of the country. This had a very negative effect on Southern whites, both losing property, which they did, but also suddenly black people were walking around. And it created 100 little points of friction every day. The black people were perceived as uppity. How do you greet somebody you used to own? How do you greet somebody who used to own you? If two people are trying to get through a narrow passageway, who yields? If they disagree on something, how do they disagree? And this was a very challenging problem. And overlaid on this was the Union Army occupation. For 11 years, we had Union Army troops through the South. And this became particularly corrosive because many of the Union troops were black. They were escaped slaves. I always love the phrase, they were self-emancipated. And at the end of the war, most of the white soldiers in the Union Army wanted to go home. For the blacks, it was a pretty good job. So now you've not only got black people walking around, being uppity, wanting to have the same rights everybody else does, but some of them are wearing uniforms. They've got guns, and they can arrest you. This was a very stressful experience. When you get this kind of social revolution, which is really what it was, when the whole caste structure of the society is torn up, it's not uncommon to get violence, and not right away at the end of the war, but within a couple of months, there was spontaneous, in many instances, violence through the South. And it, over time, became more institutionalized and organized. It is the first era of the Ku Klux Klan and many other groups, Knights of the White Camellia and Lord knows what others. And that first summer of 1865, President Johnson asks an Army general to go to the South and make a report as to conditions there. And I think he was very regretful as to who he asked. He asked a fellow named Carl Schurz, who was a German immigrant and a pretty radical Republican. And he came back with a searing report about the violence in the South. And just to read a brief passage, he wrote that he found Negroes whose ears had been cut off or whose bodies were slashed with knives or bruised with whips or bludgeons or punctured with shot wounds. Dead Negroes were found in considerable number in the country roads or on the fields, shot to death or strung on the limbs of trees. In many districts, the colored people were in a panic of fright, and the whites in an almost insane state of irritation. That phrase resonates very strongly for me, an insane state of irritation. This was the atmosphere. This was a very volatile time. Okay, so how do we get from that to Congress fighting with the president? Because that's what causes the impeachment. And I think there are a variety of things, but I'm going to focus on two elements. The first was the kind of governments that were going to be created in the South. Johnson started out, and this was described earlier, with a plan that really had been developed under the Lincoln administration. And Lincoln always said towards the end of the war, when you beat a man, you let him up easy. So he intended to allow the Southerners to form their own governments, to create state governments. So Johnson did that. And then it began to run off the rails on him. The Southern states, in their conventions and in their new legislatures, started adopting black codes. When they chose congressmen and senators, they chose, in many instances, former Confederates. About a dozen generals and colonels from the Confederate Army were elected to Congress. About a half dozen former Confederate congressmen were. Alexander Stevens, who'd been vice president of the Confederacy, was chosen by Georgia as one of its senators. Well, this was enraging to the people in the North. And over, you see in the newspapers, you see in speeches in Congress, these men have the blood of our sons and our fathers and our husbands on their hands. How can we return them to power? What did we fight the war over? And then when these men get to Washington and they want to serve in Congress, they've been chosen to serve in Congress, and it's not even that startling that they were chosen. They were the natural elite of this society. They had been the leaders of the society. But when they got there, they met Thaddeus Stevens. Now, Thaddeus Stevens is an extraordinary historical character. He's a dark figure, but I found him fascinating in a number of ways. And one of them is the guy had a sense of humor. He was crippled. He'd had a club foot from birth. He was very determined. He was devoted to equal rights, to the cause of poor people, to blacks. He was a fervent abolitionist. A friend of his once wrote that it is with Stevens as though every injustice in the world had been done to him. And what was funny about Stevens was, from my background, I think socially in our country we think of people like that as softies, bleeding hearts. Stevens was anything but a softie. He was tough, he was determined, and people in Congress were afraid of him. They didn't like to debate against him because he was so quick-witted, he was so incisive and sarcastic. And as I said, he had a mordant sense of humor. He had lost all of his hair due to a fever as a young man, or middle-aged man, young to me now. And he wore a wig. And when you see the photographs, it's this luxurious wig. I mean, you just want to run your fingers through his hair. It's curly, it's dark. He's a 75-year-old man with black curly hair. I mean, it's terrific. And after he gave a speech on the floor, he was met in one of the corridors by a woman this was a convention of the time, who said, "Oh, Mr. Stevens, that was a wonderful speech. May I have a lock of your hair?" Well, this creates some disquiet within Stevens' party because they know he's wearing a rug. And so he just reaches up, whips it off, and says, "Here, take them all." When Lincoln was first elected president, he was looking to appoint Simon Cameron to his cabinet, and he did appoint him as Secretary of War. Cameron was a Pennsylvanian like Stevens, and he had rather a juicy reputation for corruption. So Lincoln asked Stevens, "Mr. Stevens, what can you tell me about Mr. Cameron?" And Stevens said, "Well, he wouldn't steal a red-hot stove." So word gets around in Washington, that sort of dig, and Cameron grabs Stevens and says, "You can't say that about me to the president. That's just not something you can do." So Stevens goes to the president, or next time he's with the president. He says, "Mr. President, what I said that Cameron wouldn't steal a red-hot stove, I now take that back." Think about that. You may enjoy it more on the way home. When these Southern representatives and congressmen and senators get to Washington, they are met by Thaddeus Stevens, who is not going to have ex-Confederates in the Congress. They have a remarkable drama on the floor of the House when they call the roll, and the roll is called by the clerk, who happens to be his former law clerk from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And the clerk leaves out all the names of the Southern congressmen. And they're jumping up like crazy and objecting that their name's been left out. And the guy keeps going. And at the end, he recognizes Stevens to speak. Stevens was really the acknowledged leader of the House at that point. And a congressman from Tennessee jumps up and says, "Mr. Stevens, will the gentleman yield?" And Stevens turns to him and says, "I cannot yield to anyone whose name wasn't called." And that was it. They cut off all pay for the Southern senators and congressmen and sent them home. This made Andrew Johnson very angry. You had 11 states. By his philosophy, frankly, they had never left the Union. They were not being represented in Congress. He actually asked his Attorney General at one point, "Is anything done by this Congress actually constitutional? Because we don't have 11 states represented in it," or 10 after Tennessee was readmitted. And this, I think, was the stone in his shoe that never came out, that really did cause tremendous level of anger between him and the Congress. The other piece was what to do with the slaves. The southern states, in many instances, it wasn't universal, but many adopted these black codes, which denied to black people rights to vote, rights to give testimony in court, rights to serve on juries. Many civil rights were denied. There also were labor codes adopted in some places, which required that a black person must have a labor contract running from January 1 through December 31. And if you didn't have one, you were subject to arrest. You could be arrested, taken to jail, loaned out to a local employer to work for no pay. It's a straightforward restoration of slavery. This was particularly enraging to the Northern Republicans. And I totally agree with Paul that, yes, the Northerners were just as racist as the Southerners. Absolutely true. But they didn't want slavery. They had fought this war, and one of the things that was going to come out of it was the end of slavery, and they didn't want the Confederates returned to power. So they did begin to adopt legislation to change this. Civil Rights Act, District of Columbia Voting Act, Freedmen's Bureau legislation, the Reconstruction Acts ultimately. President Johnson vetoed all of these pieces of legislation. All of them eventually were passed over his veto. This created a poisonous atmosphere in Washington. And as part of this, you also had tremendous conflict over what to do with the Union Army in the South. Johnson went to considerable lengths to get rid of any Union Army generals who were enforcing the Reconstruction laws. He would transfer them and get them out of there. And this prompted Secretary of War Stanton and the General-in-Chief of the Army, Ulysses Grant, to basically undermine Johnson. And one of Grant's aides wrote afterwards that you had a President of the United States who was a traitor and a Secretary of War and a General-in-Chief of the Army who were mutineers. It's impossible to defend either of them, frankly. I think Johnson had a duty to enforce the law, and Grant and Stanton did not have the ability to just refuse to enforce what the president told them to do. This was a real vicious conflict. Ultimately, Congress decided to start stripping Johnson of powers, and they did this in amazing ways. There was a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and they didn't want Johnson to be able to replace him, so they shrank the court. They just eliminated the seat. And just to be sure that he wouldn't get a recess appointment in case somebody resigned while Congress wasn't in session, they shrank it by 2 seats. So the next guy who left the court, he still wouldn't get an appointment. They also adopted a law that required that the president could only give an order to one man in uniform, the General-in-Chief of the Army. It was illegal for him to give an order to anybody else. In fact, one of the impeachment articles, possibly the stupidest one, was that he had tried to give an order to the commandant of the District of Columbia area. They trusted, Congress trusted, Ulysses Grant. He was the General-in-Chief of the Army. So that was supposed to be the president's sole line of authority to the military. And the third thing they did is what led to the impeachment. It's the Tenure of Office Act. And this is one of those wonderful moments in our Constitution. And I love the Constitution. I wrote a book about it. I think it's terrific, but it wasn't perfect. They blew a few. They whiffed on a couple, and this was one they whiffed on. The Constitution is very clear that that the president appoints senior officials in the government and the Senate confirms them. But it's completely silent as to how you get rid of them. It just doesn't say. And when the first Congress met in 1790, they had a huge argument about this. What do we do? They're adopting legislation to set up departments of the government. And how do you fire somebody? And there was a bunch of people who said, you know, it ought to be the mirror image of the way he appoints them. So he should be able to say, I want to fire John Smith, but the Senate has to confirm it, just the way that's how someone gets appointed. Other people said, no, that's too clumsy. The president ought to just be able to fire somebody. And ultimately, those people won, although it actually required, it was a deadlock vote in the Senate. The vice president had to break the deadlock to win that. And for 70 years, that was fine. That's how the country ran. And then Andrew Johnson was president. And Congress didn't like that anymore. So they adopted this mirror image requirement. He could fire somebody, but it didn't actually take effect unless the Senate confirmed it. This is a tremendous diminution of the president's powers. He tried to veto it. They passed it over his veto. He complied with it on several occasions. But then he reached the end of his tolerance with Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. And a lot of people reached the end of their tolerance with Edwin Stanton. He's a very difficult man. Grant's memoirs run for some 500 pages, and the only person he says something unpleasant about is Edwin Stanton. And they were allies. He was overbearing. He was rude. He could be sycophantic. He could turn on 180 degrees on you. He was a very difficult guy. And for some reason, Johnson kept him in office for two years plus. Then he tried to fire him. It went to the Senate. The Senate said, we don't concur. And it was at a point when they were so much at loggerheads, the Senate wasn't going to do anything that Andrew Johnson wanted. So he swallowed that for a few weeks, and then he decided he wasn't going to put up with it, and he decided to fire Stanton on his own. And he found a man named Lorenzo Thomas, who was a general of the Army of very little distinction. His principal qualification was that Stanton hated him. And he told Thomas, I'm going to make you interim Secretary of War. And he handed him a piece of paper and said, go take over this office and execute those powers. So Thomas walks over to the War Department. If you know Washington, the White House is here and the old Executive Office building's to the left if you're looking north, and that's where the War Department was. It's just a couple of hundred yards. So Thomas walks over there, and he walks in on Stanton, and Stanton's sitting with a couple of, well, several, I think, Republican congressmen. Thomas marches to the middle of the room and initiates what I think of as the first Monty Python moment in American history. He says, I am the new Secretary of War. And Stanton reasons with him and says, no, you're not. Thomas says, yes, I am. Stanton says, no, you're not. Now, we actually have a transcript of this because all the congressmen are busily writing this down word for word. And they go back and forth like this for a while. It's rather a sandbox exchange. And ultimately, Thomas becomes so uncomfortable in the situation, which was never a problem for Stanton. He was never uncomfortable in a situation, that he left. Stanton immediately barricaded himself in the War Department, set up troops on either side of the building, sent out the alarm to all his Republican friends. People in Washington at the time said that this was more terrifying than when Lincoln was killed. It was more terrifying than when we thought the Confederate Army was on the edge of Washington. There was really a belief that there was going to be a second Civil War among many people. And Stanton, through the course of the day and into the night, resolves he's going to just stay there in the War Department. So around 10 o'clock at night, he realizes he hasn't had anything to eat. He's going to need some clean clothes in the morning. So he grabs a sergeant and says, would you please go to my house, get Mrs. Stanton to give you some food, some clean clothes, and some linens. We're going to be sleeping here. So the sergeant goes there, and Mrs. Stanton is called to the door. And the sergeant explains his errand, and Mrs. Stanton says, no. You go back and tell my husband to resign and come straight home. She had been dealing with this guy for a while. The sergeant was a resourceful man. He went to his own house and got food and linens. And Stanton stayed in the War Department for close to 3 months. Towards the end, he started sneaking out on weekends. But he really did just camp out there. So we ended up with 2 secretaries of war. You had Stanton barricaded in the War Department, not leaving the building. And you've got Lorenzo Thomas, who's walking around Washington saying he's the Secretary of War. He's going to cabinet meetings. In fact, Stanton has a lawsuit brought against Thomas for an injunction to order him to stop pretending to be the Secretary of War. This was not a good lawsuit. Within 5 days of this blow-up over replacing Stanton, the House of Representatives has impeached Johnson. They had been waiting for something that they could impeach him for. They had tried, actually, just 5 months before. And the Republican Congress had refused to impeach Johnson. The House had voted the majority against it. At that point, things slow down. Going from the event to impeachment in 5 days is really fast. And the rhetoric of the day is just appalling. They describe him as the worst criminal in history, the greatest despot in history. Now, I don't actually think he was a pretty poor president, but there was Attila the Hun. I mean, there were other people who had done less well. The delay, though, came on the Senate side, and when our friends, the lawyers, show up, because lawyers, of course, slow everything down. And that is what happened in the Senate. And ultimately, it took close to 3 months to finish the Senate trial. And I think that slowing of things down and that delay was a great thing. It allowed the country to take a breath and ask itself if it really wanted to do this. Now, I promised to talk about what factors led to his acquittal by 1 vote. I'm going to give you 5. Just to do the arithmetic, there were, God, I hope I get it right, 36 senators. That's wrong, 54 senators. They needed 36 to convict. He needed 19 votes to stop conviction. He knew he was going to get 12 votes, as Governor Edwards in Louisiana said, even if he'd been caught in bed with a live boy or a dead girl. I mean, he was going to get those 12 votes. So he had to get 7 more. And that was the game. Could he get those extra 7 votes? So reason number 1 is, as one newspaper said after the election, after the vote, after the trial, Andrew Johnson is still president because Ben Wade is still a successor. Ben Wade was the president pro tem of the Senate. He was a senator from Ohio. There was no vice president, of course. Johnson had been vice president. So Wade was a polarizing figure. He was another tough guy. He was a frontier type. During the very bitter times of the 1850s, when the Northerners and the Southerners in the Congress argued and fought sometimes, he dared the Southerners to duel him, said he would like to do it with squirrel rifles at 30 paces. And he was a polarizing figure, as I say. He also had some dangerous views. He believed that women should have the right to vote, a decided minority view at the time. He was very pro-tariff at a time when most Republicans were not. There was even a move at the last moment to have Wade resign as head of the Senate and resign his Senate seat. So Schuyler Colfax, who was the Speaker of the House, could be the successor, thinking that that would maybe mollify some of the people who couldn't stand Wade. And Wade would not play that game. Second reason was some of the Republican senators and Republicans generally started thinking, you know, this is May of 1868. The man's term as president ends 10 months from now. There's an election in the fall. Maybe we're fighting the wrong war here. Maybe we should focus on the election. And that if we actually remove this fellow from office, we might create a martyr. And that would create a backlash. And that would be a bad idea from our standpoint. And the Republicans were wise to worry about that. When Grant won, everybody knew Grant was going to be the Republican nominee by that point. And Grant only won 53% of the vote. He was by no means a runaway victor. Third was Johnson took a couple of conciliatory steps. These were not characteristic of his presidency. But there was a senator from Iowa who wanted to vote for Johnson, but knew there was concern among Republicans that if Johnson were acquitted, there would be, and this was a term that was used, a post-acquittal reign of terror. And he had served with Johnson, he knew Johnson. So he set up a meeting where he basically put this to Johnson. And he also put a second proposition to him. He said, you know, we can't have two secretaries of war. This is really bad. And so Johnson did two things. One was he made some sort of soft remarks back to Grimes about what he would do if he were acquitted. I'm not sure I would have been particularly persuaded by them, but they were enough to allow Senator Grimes to go back to the Republicans and say, Andy's going to be okay, he's not going to fry everybody. The other thing was he nominated a Secretary of War. Through this whole crisis, he had refused to nominate and send to the Senate anybody to be Secretary of War. There was a brief flutter where he was talking about sending a fellow named Thomas Ewing, an older gentleman, as a candidate, but that didn't go anywhere. And he took the view that they'll never confirm anybody I send up, so I'm not going to send anybody up. And actually, I misquoted him. What he said was, they'll never confirm anybody I want. So he picked somebody he didn't much want. There's a fellow named John Schofield, who'd been a Union general during the war, of some success. He was not a terrible man. The Republicans, though, didn't like him very much. Johnson had left him in as a Reconstruction, as head of an occupying unit in the South. So the Republicans didn't like him, Johnson didn't like him. He was perfect. And that also mollified some of the Republicans. Fourth was, and here I'm just being a lawyer second-guessing other lawyers 150 years later, but the case was tried badly by the prosecution. When you get into an impeachment case, the congressmen have to be the prosecutors. They do it themselves. There was an impeachment trial just last year of a judge down in Louisiana, and the congressman had to prosecute him. Luckily, they had a former prosecutor in Congress who did 98% of the work. And they ended up with a very unfortunate champion. If Thaddeus Stevens had been healthy, he would have been the lead prosecutor. He's a smart lawyer. He's a tough guy, as I said. I think he probably would have gotten a conviction somehow, just by terrifying people enough. But he was dying. He died within 2 months of the end of the trial. And the newspapers were covering his physical and mental decline. It's really kind of poignant. So he just wasn't up to it. So the man who took the reins was this fellow, Ben Butler. And if you've done some history of the Civil War, Butler's a pretty unattractive figure. He was literally unattractive, sort of overweight, bald, jowly, and with a cross eyes. This was not a great picture. He was a smart guy, but he was not the most ethical man in the world, and he had a very checkered reputation. He had not been a very good general at all. Butler announced that he was going to try Johnson like he would try a horse thief. This is really not how you should be speaking of the President of the United States, whatever you think about him. And I think Butler had the effect of disgusting some of the senators. He also made a big mistake, and you can see the defense lawyers goading him into it, which is, I was a defense lawyer all my life, and when you're a defense lawyer, you're in no rush. You know, the end of the trial could be really bad. So you take your time. You know, witnesses could get lost, documents could go missing, an asteroid could hit the courthouse. You don't know what might happen. Instead, Butler ended up slowing down his own case. Prosecutors should want to try the case, get to a conviction. Let's do this fast. And they did it wrong. And the defense lawyers would goad him and yank his chain and get him to give these long, stupid speeches about evidence. And there was no evidence that was new to anybody. All the evidence had been on the front page of the papers. And we all lived through the Clinton impeachment. There was no reason to have an evidentiary hearing on that. It had all been in the newspaper. And the same was true in the Johnson case. The fifth reason was a surprise to me. I was very near the end of my research when I always make lists of things I have to look at. And there was a committee report of an investigation after the impeachment trial of possible corruption in connection with the impeachment. And I went back to the books on the subject and wondered why I hadn't read about this. And it's very hard to read about it. Sometimes a scholar will put in a sentence on it and dismiss it. And I was interested in it, so I started digging away at it. And as a criminal defense lawyer, I got a definite vibration that something was going on here. And when you go to the first person recollections of the era, you find considerable evidence. There was an acquittal fund that was set up to support the president. They raised $150,000, and they raised it by tithing, basically, a bunch of federal employees, also through the whiskey ring, and I won't bore you with that, but our whiskey tax structure was so twisted that it was a lot easier to bribe everybody in the Internal Revenue Service than to actually try to make money. So it was a very corrupt part of the world, and the whiskey companies wanted the status quo. And there were negotiations, and Johnson's own people recorded the negotiations. 3 votes for $40,000, 4 votes for $30,000. I cannot put dollars in a senator's pocket. The records don't exist that allow that. It was an era of cash. If you remember Watergate, if some of you are old enough, cash is hard to trace. But I have candidates. Edmund Ross of Kansas was a backbencher, a senator of very little distinction, who for 89 days said he was going to vote to convict Johnson. He spent the 90th day, pretty much 24 hours, in the company of the 2 principal fixers of the Johnson administration, and then he votes to acquit, and he's the vote. He's the 7th vote. And within a short period of time, he's sending over requests for patronage appointments, and he gets them. And they are of some very juicy characters. One in particular, Perry Fuller, was, by all accounts, just a straight-up crook who had actually purchased Ross's seat in the Senate by bribing the Kansas legislature. This was a revelation to me. It turns out Kansas, which I think of as good, honest, and true farmer types, in the 1860s, it was just a cesspool. I pick a fight on this with John Kennedy at Profiles in Courage, which is a book I loved as a boy. And he has a chapter on Edmund G. Ross, and he calls Ross's vote perhaps the most heroic moment in American history. I don't think so. And what's fascinating about this is, Washington was a small town then. People knew that these guys were walking around with a lot of money, looking for somebody to buy. And you don't have to even accept that whether or not they bought someone, but we know they were there looking for somebody to buy. But when the vote finally comes in, all of these people who are calling Andrew Johnson the worst despot in history accept the verdict. That's a fascinating thing. This second Civil War, this blood flowing in the streets, rage that we had seen just 90 days before, is gone. And that's what I want to talk about as my third point, just in conclusion, which is the power of the impeachment clause. There are lots of cheap shots you can take at the impeachment clause. It's incomprehensible. High crimes and misdemeanors is something we have argued about for 224 years. There is no agreement as to what it means. Does it have to be a crime? It sure sounds like it, high crimes and misdemeanors, but I actually don't think so. It comes from the statutes of Edward III or Edward I in the 14th century. Will any crime do? It says crimes, but it says high crimes. Well, I actually don't think any crime will do. I think it needs to be an abusive office, to be very concrete about it. I think Bill Clinton committed perjury, And I don't think that was an impeachable offense. It was about his personal life, and I don't think it mattered for his fitness for office. You could not vote for him for it, but I don't think the Senate could remove him for it. But there's also a fundamental sort of blind or illusion about the impeachment clause. It looks judicial. High crimes and misdemeanors, we have a trial, the House approves articles of impeachment, the Senate tries the case and convicts or acquits. But it's not a judicial proceeding. It's a political proceeding. You have one branch of the government that's decapitating the other branch. It's a huge deal politically, but the president suffers no other injury. He doesn't go to jail, he doesn't face a fine, nothing. And it is fundamentally a political act. And that, I think, is how, at the end of the day, most senators who vote on impeachments end up thinking about it. Should we remove this president or not? What is in the best interest of the country? And I always am reminded of what Ben Franklin said at the Constitutional Convention when the impeachment clause was first proposed, and I hasten to say that it's clear that the delegates to the convention did not quite know what high crimes and misdemeanors meant. But he said, you know, we should have something like that because otherwise the only way you get rid of a bad president is to kill him. Very practical, but true. And I think you see that, actually, in the Johnson case. The rage that had been building against him for all these months of his face-off with Congress is finally put to the test. And I think at the end of those 90 days, there were enough people in the country, putting aside how the senators voted, there were enough people in the country who said to themselves, I don't know that this is worth it. And that's why there was no outrage. And I think that's a tremendous virtue, that we have this structure that requires everything to slow down. Thank God for the lawyers. It's often said that the true test of a constitutional government is whether there can be a peaceful transfer of power between contending factions. Well, impeachment is that test squared, because you do it in the middle of the term. You do it for a reason, for a high crime and misdemeanor. And you're overturning the vote of the people, which is a big deal. And I think that the impeachment clause actually served us well because it allowed a more considered approach to the Johnson case. I've been clear about this in my book, and I will be here. I would have voted to convict the guy. I think he was an unfortunate president, and I think he failed to enforce the law when he should have. He was required to. But I also think his acquittal turned out not to be a disaster for the country. And I think the Constitution gets a lot of credit for that. Thank you for your attention, and we'll take some questions.
If you have questions either for Professor Bergeron or Mr. Stewart, please go ahead and ask them about either of the lectures. Yeah.
I've heard this as a rumor. Did John F. Kennedy actually write the file of courage?
No. Ted Sorensen actually admitted right before he died that he had written most of it. He insisted that Kennedy went over everything. So he knew what was in it, and he edited it. He may well have participated in planning it, identifying who was, it's really a political campaign document. It's 8 heroes of the Senate that just happen to be from 8 different parts of the country. It was getting him ready to run for president. So, I have to confess, I find it not a very good piece of scholarship. There's another chapter in it about Lucius Lamar, who was a senator from Mississippi, which a book came out a few years ago called Redemption by Nicholas Lemon, which basically assaults that chapter and says it's all fantasy. So it was an entertaining book As a boy, I loved it, but it's hard to endorse.
You had your hand up first on the third row.
Whatever happened to Andrew Johnson? How did he live out? Wife? What sort of family? Did he have a wife and children? How did that all go?
In response to the last question, he had a wife and children. He had 3 sons and 2 daughters. 2 daughters lived in the White House during Johnson's presidency and basically ran the White House because Johnson's wife was sick most of the time and something of a recluse, lived in the 2nd-story bedroom, didn't move. Johnson's 3 sons all were very pathetic, tragic figures. Robert Johnson committed suicide 1 month after Johnson left the White House. The thing is that Johnson returned to Greenville, Tennessee in March of '69, determined to vindicate his career, to find some kind of justification, some kind of exoneration of whatever you want to say. So he immediately began campaigning for office. Now, everybody thought he had no political future, but Johnson didn't buy that. And he had been sent a number of letters, which we have in volume 16, of people urging him to seek public office, whether it was governor of Tennessee, U.S. senator, whatever, so forth. Long story short, he ran for U.S. Senate. And when I say ran, I mean you don't run for it because it's not a popular election. The legislature chooses. But he lost out in a very tight vote in '69, late '69. So he could have gone back to the Senate had that been successful. So he lost that, and that was revenge brought by Confederate generals in Tennessee who were going to set the story straight for him because they loathed it, which I think is a badge of honor for Johnson. Then Johnson ran for the U.S. Congress. There was a congressman at a large seat open in Tennessee. Ran for that, lost, but helped his Republican friend Horace Maynard get the seat. So there was poetic justice there. There were 3 people running. The Democratic candidate was a former Confederate general, and he lost. Johnson was happy about that. Finally, in '74, Johnson started a first covert and then overt campaign to win a Senate seat, U.S. Senate seat, and he was successful. He was elected by the Tennessee legislature in January of '75. And so he is the only former president to return to the Senate. And he returned to the Senate because Grant, who was president, called a special session of the Senate in the spring of '75. So Johnson went back to the scene of the crime and was welcomed by friend and foe alike. And he served that brief special session, and he died in the end of July of '75. So it was a short term, but he got his vindication, you might argue.
Barry, you had a question.
Professor Stewart, I believe you said that you would remove Johnson from office, but not only in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, but not enforcing federal law to some extent.
Yeah, this is, my view is controversial. But I do believe that a president who fails to enforce the law on an important matter, not the width of a barge on a canal, but on the central issue before the country at the time. Imagine a president today refusing to enforce the civil rights laws. Is subject to impeachment. I'm not sure I could have voted for any of the impeachment articles that were presented. They were pretty narrow, legalistic articles, except for Article 11, which was a bit of a catch-all. But I do think there were grounds.
We had a question, right?
What about the allegations that Johnson had a drinking problem?
It'll never go away, that allegation.
And also, how would you have voted on the trial?
Okay. Do I need to be at the mic? Can you hear me? Oh, you need it. Recording, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The allegations about drunkenness are way exaggerated. someone asked me earlier about the inauguration, his vice presidential thing. Yes, he was speaking under the influence, could have been arrested for SUI, but that was not a common problem for him, and there is no other problem throughout his presidency. Although, as I said a while ago to a person who asked me about this, people brought that up all the time because that was an easy way to explain any of Johnson's actions, especially when he was out on the speaking tours and making crazy speeches, ranting and raving. They said, well, you know he was drunk. That was not true. He did occasionally drink, and people who are teetotalers think that means that you're a drunkard, but I don't think so. And there's no evidence to show that it impaired him in any way after that initial scene, and that was very unfortunate. You know, it should not have happened, but it did. And Hanlon may have had a hand in it by offering several drinks before the ceremonies, but we won't go there. I would not have voted for impeachment. I don't think there was a case. And I think Benjamin Curtis, the former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, who was one of Johnson's legal counsel, made a magnificent argument in behalf of defense of Johnson. And he, according even to some of the Republicans later, really set the bar high enough that there was not much the Republicans could do. Butler himself even admitted that the Johnson lawyers were far better than the House managers were, which is absolutely, I believe, is true. but you can't, you can't ever run away from what the general public thinks, and everybody says, well, he's the worst president, just like that. And I don't think so. I do think he needs credit for where he should get it, and I think he did a number of things well. I wish that he'd been humorous and charming and all that, but he wasn't. He was not a hail fellow well met. He's a very determined and successful politician behind the scenes. My take on him is that he's not the best president I've had, not even the middle, but somewhere down below. But here's the issue that really is the one that has been working since the 1950s against Johnson. That is the race question. And once he has been hit with that, he can't recover, and has not recovered. And my argument is there's far more to the story than race. That is one component of it. I'm not going to walk away from that, and I'm not going to defend his racism, but that's not the whole story. And so, I mean, I could go into a lot more details, and I don't think you want to hear all that, but that's just my take on it. And I think that had he had a good PR firm or something, he might have come out looking a lot better.
We agree on a couple things. I think he had an extremely difficult time to be president. Maybe even tougher than being a war president, trying to heal a nation. And I think he was uniquely ill-suited to heal a nation. It wasn't his personality. It wasn't his bent. So you had a mismatch. And I've got to agree, if you look at a drunk president like Franklin Pierce and compare him to a guy like Johnson who showed up for work every day and worked real hard and did the best he could, it's, he doesn't get a complete fair shake. But I do think he was just a terrible president for that moment in history. And it was unfortunate for the country. It was unfortunate for him.
Let me add a footnote here. I think all Lincoln supporters, of whom I am one, give thanks to Andrew Johnson, because Johnson had to fall on the grenade. In effect, to win the peace was more difficult than winning the war. And Lincoln was spared that, I mean, by tragic circumstances, yes, but spared that challenge. And remember, he was already being challenged in 1864, not only because of his chance to get reelected, but because of how he begins to start saying, here's how I want to reconstruct the South. The Wade Davis bill came along and said, you're doing this all wrong. And the people who were strongest enemies of Lincoln became the strongest enemies of Johnson, starting out as his allies, but realizing he's not going to do what they want. I think we're all talking about a power struggle. That's what I see it. It's a question of leadership and power. And Johnson is caught in the middle of all that. And yes, he lacked skills an effective leader will have. But you just, I mean, at one point you have to say, are you the commander-in-chief or you're not? And when the military, they keep trying to chip away his powers, I think he has to fight back. And he did. And I think we should feel some sense of obligation to him for saying, I'm not going to let you run over the presidency entirely. You can run over me, but you're not going to destroy the presidency. And I think we have to make a distinction here, that he is trying to uphold the rights, the constitutional rights of the presidency. And Thaddeus Stevens, whom we've quoted many times, said in a speech to his constituents in Lancaster, we want to teach the president to obey us. And what kind of leadership is that? The president doesn't have to obey, the Congress. They can fight and so forth and so on, but it's not Congress's call to say, you obey us, because we're elected by the people. Well, so is the president. In our perverse kind of way, we elect presidents. We can get into that. Johnson favored direct election of U.S. president.
He did.
Yeah, which I thought was very far-looking on his part. Okay, that's enough of that.
We have time for one more question.
I want to ask, you covered what happened when he left office, but what happened for the tail end of his term there after the impeachment? Just nothing.
Interesting, and I was interested in that because he gets this delegation from Senator Grimes saying, will there be a post-acquittal reign of terror? And he says, no friend of the Constitution need fear anything from me, which is sort of an ambiguous response, to be honest. Johnson knew how to not overpromise. And I don't think he changed. I think he kept vetoing stuff. Arkansas wanted to come back in the Union. He vetoed it because he thought it was illegal that they were out of the Union. 6 other states were coming in the Union. He vetoed those. He kept making, I'll be blunt, terrible patronage appointments, appointing crooks to whom he owed something. So I don't see him as chastened. He was the same guy. And I don't think, it's his virtue and it's his vice. He doesn't change. He is who he is. What interested me, I meant to say this earlier, is Johnson took the view that he had had an extremely successful presidency, that he had thwarted Congress, he had thwarted the Republicans. When he was trying to get nominated as the Democratic candidate for president in the summer of 1868, and he says to his aide, every time I've gone toe-to-toe with Grant, I've won. They should be making me the Democratic candidate for president. I can take this man. So he really thought of himself as an extremely successful president in difficult times. He certainly was not a fool. He understood that. So, I mean, I do see him as a guy who's just, he was on the wrong side of history. And it wasn't his fault that he was, but he was.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone again for being here. As I said, this is a event of the North Carolina History Project. I want to thank Campbell Law School for co-sponsoring this as well. And I also want to thank Justice Bob Orr, who's here with the North Carolina Institute for Constitutional Law. Thank him for his support for the event because his organization also sponsored this CLE event too. So thanks again for being here, and I'm sure if you have any more questions, the authors will be happy to answer them, and their books are outside on the table. Thank you.
From May 10th, 2011, this has been part 2 of a 2-part examination of the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. The forum was presented by the North Carolina History Project, Campbell Law School, and the North Carolina Institute for Constitutional Law. For more information about the North Carolina History Project, visit northcarolinahistory.org. You can download this and other programming at voterradio.com.